Picture the meeting. You have sat in a version of it 100 times, whether you noticed it or not. A woman leans forward, takes a breath, and begins to speak. And before she has finished her second sentence, someone else's voice slides in over hers. Not out of malice, not even consciously, but simply because some quiet calculation has already been made in the room about whose words carry weight. 10 minutes later, a man says almost the same thing, in almost the same tone, and the room nods. Notes get taken. Credit gets assigned. Nobody in that room would say out loud that they doubted her authority before she opened her mouth, and most of them would be genuinely offended if you suggested it. And yet the doubt was there, humming underneath the polite surface of the conversation, shaping who got interrupted and who got believed. You have probably felt this from one side of the table or the other, either as the person whose words seemed to evaporate on contact with the air, or as the person who, without meaning to, filled the silence she left behind. Maybe you have watched it happen to a colleague you respected enormously, someone whose judgment you trusted completely in private conversation, and still noticed the room treat her differently the moment the meeting officially began. Maybe you have watched it happen to yourself, felt the strange, deflating sensation of having your own point restated by someone else minutes later and suddenly taken seriously, as if the idea had only become credible once it left a different mouth. But here is the strange part. The part that makes this so much more interesting than a simple story about sexism in the office. The doubt does not begin with her words at all. It begins before that. It begins with a set of signals your brain was reading and ranking long before language ever entered the picture. Signals inherited from a period of human history so old that the very idea of a meeting would have been unrecognizable. And the real answer to why you doubt a woman's authority before she even speaks is far stranger and far older than anything happening in that conference room. To understand what is actually happening, you have to stop thinking about this as a modern problem with a modern cause, and start thinking about it as a very old piece of software running on very new hardware. Your brain did not evolve in boardrooms. It evolved in small, mobile bands of humans, rarely larger than a few dozen people, who depended on fast, accurate judgments about who could be trusted to lead in a crisis, who could be trusted to share food fairly, and who was likely to become a threat if given too much unchecked power. Those judgments had to happen in seconds, often before a person had said a single word, because in a world with predators, rival groups, and unpredictable environmental danger, waiting for a full debate before deciding who to follow could get you killed. So your ancestors' brains built shortcuts. They built rapid, largely unconscious systems for scanning a person's voice, posture, size, and confidence, and assigning them a kind of provisional rank before any actual evidence of competence had been presented. That system did not disappear when humans started building cities, writing laws, and eventually sitting in glass-walled conference rooms, arguing about quarterly targets. It simply kept running, quietly, underneath everything, and it is still running in you right now, every time you meet someone new, and form an instant, wordless impression of whether they seem like the person in charge. The question worth sitting with, then, is not simply why a specific woman in a specific meeting gets doubted, but why an ancient survival shortcut built for hunting bands and emergency decisions is still quietly voting on who deserves authority in a world that looks nothing like the one that built it. Start with something as basic as the sound of a voice, because researchers have discovered that it matters far more than most people would ever guess. The political scientist Casey Klofstad and his colleagues ran a series of experiments in which they altered the pitch of recorded voices, both male and female, reading identical scripted sentences, and then asked listeners to choose which speaker they would prefer as a leader. Over and over, across different samples of listeners, the lower-pitched voice won, and it won by a wide margin, even though the content of what was being said never changed at all. Lower pitch, it turns out, gets unconsciously decoded by the human brain as a signal of size, strength, and dominance. A leftover association from a period of human evolution when larger bodies and deeper voices really did correlate with physical formidability, and physical formidability really did matter for group survival. The trouble is that average adult female voices sit, on average, in a higher pitch range than average adult male voices, for reasons rooted purely in vocal cord length and laryngeal anatomy, with nothing whatsoever to do with intelligence, competence, or leadership ability. So before a woman in that meeting has said anything meaningful at all, before she has presented a single fact or made a single argument, The raw acoustic signature of her voice is already being run through a piece of ancient perceptual machinery that quietly nudges the room toward crediting deeper voices with more authority. Have you ever noticed how many prominent women in politics and business have been coached, sometimes explicitly, to lower their vocal pitch when they speak in public? That is not vanity. That is an attempt to manually override a bias that most listeners do not even know they are running. Voice is only the beginning, because the same ancient sorting system is also constantly reading posture, facial expression, and what researchers call nonverbal dominance displays, and it is reading them in ways that quietly punish women for the very behaviors that would earn a man credit as a strong leader. The psychologist Victoria Brescol has spent much of her career studying how expressions of anger are received differently depending on who is expressing them. In one striking set of studies, she found that when men expressed anger in a professional setting, especially while explaining a mistake or a setback, observers tended to view them as more competent and more deserving of higher status afterward, as though the anger signaled passionate commitment to getting things right. When women expressed the exact same anger, in the exact same context, using the exact same words, observers tended to rate them as less competent, and crucially, as less deserving of authority, often attributing the anger to some internal emotional instability, rather than to the situation itself. Think about what that means for a woman trying to lead through a crisis. If she stays calm, she may be seen as insufficiently forceful, insufficiently invested, lacking the fire a real leader is supposed to have. If she shows the exact same fire a man would be praised for showing, she risks being quietly recategorized as difficult, emotional, or unfit to lead. It is a trap, with no comfortable exit, and it did not appear because of some modern conspiracy against women. It appeared because ancient status detection systems, built around expectations of who is supposed to display dominance and who is supposed to display warmth, quietly punish anyone who violates the expected pattern, and women violate it simply by expressing the same emotions men are rewarded for expressing. This pattern has a name in social psychology, and understanding the name helps explain why it feels so stubbornly resistant to good intentions. The psychologists Alice Eagley and Stephen Carrow developed what they called role congruity theory, built on decades of research into how people evaluate leaders. Their argument, stated simply, is that most cultures carry two overlapping sets of expectations that quietly collide inside a woman who steps into a position of authority. The first set of expectations concerns what a good woman is supposed to be like: warm, communal, accommodating, focused on the needs of others. The second set of expectations concerns what a good leader is supposed to be like: assertive, decisive, comfortable exercising power over others, willing to prioritize the group's goals over any single person's feelings. For men, these two sets of expectations mostly overlap without much friction, because the traits culturally coded as masculine and the traits culturally coded as leadership-worthy have historically been treated as nearly the same list. For women, the two lists conflict directly, which means that a woman in a leadership role is almost always violating one expectation or the other. Act warm and communal, and she may be seen as a wonderful colleague but not tough enough to lead. Act assertive and decisive, the very traits that would earn a man praise as a natural leader, and she risks being seen as cold, aggressive, or unlikable, someone who has failed to be a good woman, even while succeeding as a competent executive. Eagley and Carrow's research found this penalty showing up again and again across evaluations of political candidates, corporate managers, and military officers. A remarkably consistent double bind sitting quietly underneath decisions that felt, to the people making them, like simple, neutral judgments of competence. If role congruity theory explains the trap women face once they are already in a leadership role, the sociologist Cecilia Ridgway's work on what she calls status characteristics theory helps explain something even more fundamental: why the doubt arrives before any role has even been assigned. Ridgway's research shows that human groups, almost automatically and almost instantly, sort people into rough status categories based on visible characteristics, gender chief among them, and then use that initial sorting to set expectations about who is likely to contribute valuable ideas in a group task. In her studies of small task groups working on shared problems, she found that men were, on average, given more opportunities to speak, had their contributions evaluated more positively when they did speak, and were more likely to be credited as influential group members, even in groups explicitly told that men and women were equally qualified for the task at hand. The bias was not the product of any single hostile individual. It emerged from the aggregate, almost mechanical operation of a status sorting system that both men and women in the study were running simultaneously, often while sincerely believing themselves to be perfectly fair. This is the piece that makes the whole picture so much stranger and so much harder to simply argue your way out of. The doubt directed at a woman's authority frequently is not coming from conscious prejudice at all. It is coming from a rapid, largely automatic status assignment process, similar in kind to the ancient voice and posture reading system described earlier, quietly deciding, within seconds of a woman entering a room, how much of the group's attention and credibility she is likely to deserve. What makes Ridgway's findings especially difficult to dismiss is how little it took to trigger the effect. The participants in her studies were not selected because they held openly sexist views, and in many cases, they explicitly endorsed gender equality when asked directly. The bias appeared anyway, consistently, because status characteristics theory does not describe a belief someone holds so much as a background expectation someone carries, largely without noticing they are carrying it, about which categories of people are statistically more likely to be competent at a given task. Once that background expectation exists, even faintly, it shapes something researchers call a performance expectation state, an unconscious prediction about how valuable a given person's next contribution is likely to be, and that prediction quietly governs how closely people listen, how much credit they extend, and how quickly they interrupt. The unsettling implication is that you do not need to consciously believe women are less capable leaders for this system to operate inside you. You only need to have absorbed, from decades of cultural exposure, the same statistical association everyone else absorbs, the association between authority and masculinity, and the system will do the rest of the work on its own, entirely below the level of conscious intention. Now push the timeline back even further, past corporate boardrooms and political campaigns, past even the earliest written records of human civilization, and ask a harder question. Was this always the pattern? Was human social organization always structured around an assumption that authority belonged by nature to men? The anthropological evidence tells a much more complicated and genuinely surprising story. The primatologist and anthropologist Christopher Boehm spent decades studying small-scale hunter-gatherer societies, the closest living approximation available to the social structures our ancestors likely lived in for the vast majority of human evolutionary history. And what he found was not a world of clear, stable male dominance hierarchies at all. Instead, Boehm documented what he called reverse dominance hierarchies, in which bands actively and collectively worked to prevent any single individual, male or female, from accumulating too much unchecked power. Leadership in these societies tended to be situational and fluid rather than fixed and inherited, with different individuals taking the lead depending on the specific skill the moment required, whether that was tracking game, resolving a dispute, or organizing a move to new territory. Authority, in other words, was not automatically handed to whoever displayed the most dominance. It was something closer to earned influence, granted temporarily and revocable if abused. If the earliest and longest-lasting form of human social organization was this fluid and this situational, then the rigid association between authority and masculinity that feels so natural today cannot be some fixed law of human nature. It has to be something that was built later, layered on top of a much older and much more flexible foundation. So what changed? Anthropologists and historians studying the shift from small mobile bands to larger, settled agricultural societies point toward a cluster of transformations that reshaped who held formal power, transformations that had far less to do with any inherent difference in leadership ability between men and women than with brute material realities of reproduction, property, and physical labor. As populations settled into fixed territories and began accumulating surplus resources, land and livestock became things worth defending, inheriting, and fighting over. And the societies that organized themselves around intense competition for those resources tended to reward the specific advantages that came with greater average upper body strength in physical conflict. At the same time, the demands of near-constant childbearing and nursing in high-fertility agricultural societies tied women more tightly to the immediate vicinity of the home and the young in a way that had been far less rigid in earlier, more mobile foraging bands where children were often cared for collectively across the whole group. None of this reflected some biological verdict that women were less capable of judgment, strategy, or leadership. It reflected which specific capacities happened to be most rewarded by the particular economic and military pressures of that specific era, and once those particular pressures rewarded male dominance for long enough, across generation after generation, the pattern hardened into something that felt, eventually, like it had always been the natural order of things. Even though the anthropological record makes clear it was never the only order available to human societies, and was not even the original one. Even after this hardening began, though, the historical record refuses to offer the clean story you might expect, the one where male authority simply marched forward unopposed, once agriculture and property entered the picture. Scattered across very different continents and very different centuries, you find women who took hold of formal, undisputed political and military authority, often ruling over territories as large and as complex as any led by a man, and often ruling them with striking effectiveness. Hatshepsut governed Egypt for roughly 2 decades, commissioning ambitious building projects and trade expeditions, and evidently secured her authority firmly enough that later attempts to erase her name from the historical record only reveal how seriously that authority had once been taken. In West Africa, the warrior queen Amina of Zazzau is remembered for expanding her state's territory and securing trade routes through sustained military campaigns she personally led. In 16th century India, Rani Durgavati governed the kingdom of Gondwana for years, overseeing administration and defense until she died leading her own troops in battle rather than surrender her territory. None of these women fit neatly into a story where leadership authority was ever biologically reserved for men, and none of them fit into a story where societies were incapable of recognizing a woman's authority when circumstances demanded it. What they suggest instead is that female leadership has always been possible, has always occasionally broken through, and has always tended to require women to clear a far higher bar of proof before that authority was granted or accepted, a pattern that should sound familiar, because it is the exact same pattern still quietly operating in the meeting you pictured at the beginning of this video. Here is where the story takes its sharpest and most counterintuitive turn, the twist that changes how you should think about every meeting, every campaign, every boardroom you will ever sit in again. If the doubt directed at women's authority really were rooted in some accurate, evolved detection of actual leadership ability, you would expect female leaders to perform worse, on average, once given real power, particularly under conditions of genuine crisis, where poor leadership decisions carry real, measurable costs. That is not what the evidence shows. In fact, in study after study across corporate and political contexts, researchers have found something closer to the opposite pattern in certain conditions. Alex Haslam and Michelle Ryan's research on what has become known as the glass cliff phenomenon found that women are disproportionately promoted into leadership positions, specifically during periods of crisis, instability, or high risk of failure, precisely the moments when a leadership role is most likely to end in blame rather than credit. And when researchers have examined outcomes during genuine emergencies, some studies of organizational and even national level crisis leadership have found that teams and countries led by women performed comparably to, and in several documented cases outperformed, comparable groups led by men, even while public perception continued to lag behind, still quietly discounting a woman's competence relative to a man's in the very same role. Multiple analyses of large public companies, including research compiled by organizations like Catalyst, tracking gender diversity on corporate boards and executive teams, have found that companies with more women in senior leadership positions tend to perform as well as, and in a number of these analyses better than, comparable companies with predominantly male leadership, measured through return on equity, return on invested capital, and other standard financial metrics. Correlation of this kind can never fully prove causation on its own, since better-run companies may simply be more likely to promote women in the first place, but the finding is nonetheless difficult to reconcile with the idea that markets are quietly rewarding some real competence gap favoring male leadership. If anything, the persistent gap between how female leaders are perceived and how they actually perform suggests the ancient sorting system is not just occasionally wrong, but systematically miscalibrated, consistently underestimating a category of leaders it was never designed to correctly evaluate in the first place. If the ancient sorting mechanism described earlier were actually tracking real leadership competence, this gap between perception and performance should not exist. But it does exist, consistently, which strongly suggests that what your brain is doing when it doubts a woman's authority is not measuring her actual ability at all. It is pattern matching against an old, narrow template of what leadership is supposed to look and sound like, a template built during a period of human history that has almost nothing in common with the conditions under which leadership is actually exercised today, and mistaking a mismatch with that outdated template for genuine evidence of incompetence. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reframes the entire problem. The doubt is not a rational read on a woman's abilities. It is closer to an optical illusion, a perceptual glitch produced by machinery built for a different environment entirely, misfiring in a context it was never designed to evaluate. And once you understand it as an illusion rather than an insight, the next question becomes obvious. If this ancient sorting system is this reliably wrong, why has it not simply been corrected by generations of accumulated evidence, proving women can lead exactly as well as men? Part of the answer lies in a phenomenon psychologists call implicit bias, extensively documented by the researchers Anthony Greenwald and Mazarin Banaji through decades of work with the implicit association test. Their research demonstrated something uncomfortable but well replicated. People can sincerely, consciously believe in gender equality, can genuinely intend to judge men and women by identical standards, and can still carry automatic, below-conscious associations, linking men more strongly with words like leader, authority, and competence, and linking women more strongly with words like support, assistant, and family. These associations are not chosen. They are absorbed, slowly and continuously. From decades of cultural exposure to media, history books, workplace hierarchies, and everyday language that has, for most of recorded history, quietly repeated the pattern that authority looks and sounds male. The implicit association does not care what you consciously believe about gender equality. It operates faster than conscious belief, activating within milliseconds, well before your deliberate, values-driven reasoning even has time to weigh in. So even someone who would loudly and sincerely defend a woman's right to lead can still, without any awareness of doing so, feel that flicker of hesitation, that split-second recalibration of credibility, the very moment she opens her mouth to speak. Now bring this back down out of the laboratory and into the meeting you pictured at the start, because this is where the ancient and the modern collide most visibly. Watch what happens the next time you are in a group setting where a woman is presenting an idea. Notice how often she is interrupted compared to the men around her, and notice how often those interruptions come not from hostility, but from an unconscious sense that finishing her thought is somehow optional, in a way finishing a man's thought would not be. Notice how often her ideas get quietly restated by someone else in the room minutes later, phrased almost identically, and receive enthusiastic agreement the second time in a way they did not the first. Researchers studying workplace meetings have documented this pattern repeatedly, sometimes calling it hipeating, and it is a small, almost invisible example of exactly the ancient status sorting mechanism described earlier, doing its quiet work in real time, deciding whose voice deserves the group's attention before any conscious evaluation of the idea's actual merit has taken place. Notice too how differently competence and warmth get weighed against each other depending on who is displaying them. A man who is blunt, direct, and unconcerned with being liked is often described as a strong, no-nonsense leader. A woman displaying the identical bluntness is disproportionately more likely to be described as difficult, cold, or hard to work with. The exact double-bind Eagly and Carouse role congruity research predicted decades ago, still playing out today in performance reviews, promotion decisions, and quiet hallway conversations about who seems ready for the next level of leadership. You can trace this same ancient sorting mechanism even further back along the pipeline, well before anyone reaches the meeting room at all, into the language used to describe candidates before they are ever hired or promoted. Researchers analyzing performance reviews and hiring language across large organizations have repeatedly found that women are more likely to be described using communal language, words like helpful, supportive, and collaborative, while men are more likely to be described using agentic language, words like confident, decisive, and strategic, the very vocabulary organizations use internally to decide who looks like leadership material. A resume or a review does not announce itself as biased. It simply uses the words that feel natural to the person writing it, drawn from the same well of cultural association that Greenwald and Banerjee's research on implicit bias identified decades ago. And those words quietly accumulate, review after review, promotion cycle after promotion cycle, until a woman with an identical track record to a male colleague finds herself consistently described as reliable rather than visionary, as a strong team player rather than a strong leader. By the time she reaches the meeting where her authority gets doubted before she has finished speaking, the doubt has already been rehearsed dozens of times before, in dozens of smaller decisions that never felt, to anyone making them, like they had anything to do with gender at all. None of this means the ancient system is villainous, or that everyone running it is secretly hostile toward women, because that framing misses what is actually happening and makes the problem far harder to address. The system evolved to solve a real and urgent problem, fast group coordination under conditions of genuine survival pressure, and for most of human evolutionary history, it likely served that purpose reasonably well, or at least well enough that the humans running it survived to reproduce. The trouble is not that the system is malicious. The trouble is that it is old, and the world it was built for no longer exists. Leadership today rarely requires the ability to physically dominate rivals, or intimidate a hostile band into retreat. It requires the ability to synthesize complex information, coordinate large groups of specialized people, communicate clearly under pressure, and make sound judgments about long-term trade-offs, none of which correlate meaningfully with vocal pitch, upper body strength, or the willingness to display anger in a meeting. But the ancient system does not know that. It is still scanning for the same old signals it was built to scan for, still quietly weighting deep voices and physically imposing posture more heavily than the evidence actually warrants, and still treating any woman who steps outside the narrow zone of warm and communal as somehow suspicious, regardless of how well she is actually performing the job in front of her. So what does it mean for you, specifically, sitting wherever you are sitting right now, hearing all of this? It means the next time you notice that flicker of hesitation about a woman's authority, that split-second feeling that something about her leadership does not quite add up, even though you cannot immediately say why, you now have a genuine choice about how to interpret that feeling. You can treat it as reliable information, the same way your ancestors were forced to treat their instant judgments about who to follow into danger, because they rarely had time to do anything else. Or you can recognize the feeling for what modern research increasingly shows it actually is, an old alarm going off in a world it was never built to monitor. A piece of inherited perceptual machinery, pattern matching against a template that has little to do with the actual demands of the situation in front of you. That distinction matters enormously, because the moment you can name the ancient system for what it is, you gain the ability to consciously override it, to pause before letting that flicker of doubt shape your next action, to notice when you are about to interrupt, restate, or quietly discount, and to ask yourself honestly whether the doubt is tracking something real about the person in front of you, or is simply the echo of 100,000 years of hunting bands, deep voices, and physical dominance contests that have nothing whatsoever to do with whether she is right. And this is where the story loops back to where it began. Picture that meeting again, the woman leaning forward, taking a breath, beginning to speak. The doubt that rises in the room before she has finished her second sentence still feels, in the moment, like a simple, neutral judgment, quiet, automatic, almost invisible even to the people producing it. But you now know what that doubt actually is. It is not evidence, it is an echo, carried forward from an era so distant that the very concept of a conference room, a quarterly report, or a leadership title would have made no sense at all. An ancient shortcut still quietly voting on authority, in a world that has left behind almost everything it was originally built to evaluate. None of this means the echo is easy to silence, and it would be dishonest to pretend that simply knowing about an ancient bias makes it disappear on contact with awareness. Every researcher named in this video would tell you the same thing. Implicit associations built over decades of cultural exposure do not vanish the moment you learn they exist, any more than an optical illusion stops looking like an illusion once someone explains how it works. What awareness actually buys you is smaller and more useful than instant transformation. It buys you a half-second of hesitation, a tiny window between the automatic flicker of doubt and whatever action you would have taken in response to it, interrupting, discounting, mentally filing her contribution as somehow less weighty than the version a deeper voice might have offered. In that half second, you get to ask a question your ancestors never had the luxury of asking, because their environment never gave them the time. Is this doubt actually about her, or is it about 100,000 years of hunting bands, deep voices, and physical dominance contests that have nothing to do with the argument she is making right now? The real question was never whether she deserves to be believed. The real question, the one worth carrying with you long after this video ends, is whether you are willing to notice the ancient alarm going off in your own head and choose, deliberately, not to obey it.